This was my plane. I was the AC. My name's Christopher. Lieutenant John Christopher. Jim Garth had been with me overseas with my co-pilot. The navigator was Scott Jordan. And Sergeant Elmer Caruzio was about the best radio man anybody could have. In the cargo compartment, taking life easy temporarily, was Vic Farwell, the flight engineer, and Massey, Irv Massey, his assistant. Altogether, we were a pretty good team. We could get along as well as most of you in the audience, I guess. That is, when things were all okay. Oh, by the way, here's some terrain over which you'll be doing a lot of flying once you're in the north. This is the Arctic tundra, vast stretches of flat or gently rolling soggy terrain. Now in the summer, with the snow of winter gone, it is thickly carpeted with a variety of plants and grasses. In most of the polar land regions of the northern part of the world, you'll find tundra. More specifically, it lies here along the flat coastal plains and in the valleys between mountain ranges. It covers an area of many hundreds of thousands of square miles. Wet, bleak, uninhabited for the most part. Here is a veritable lost world where living is extremely difficult. The best way of crossing the tundra, in most areas the only way, is by flying. This aircraft is C-119 7770, en route to a remote coastal Air Force installation. Cargo, a capacity load for this flight, 12,000 pounds of machine supplies. Aircraft on course, flying airwaves. Well, on that particular day, I was all out for getting some pictures with a new camera I just bought. There was a caribou herd in that section of the tundra, and I wanted to get a picture of them. I looked around for the animals and decided they might be off to the east a bit, over nearer some foothills. Caribou stay pretty close to high ground as a rule. I thought about flying over there 50 or 60 miles away and taking a look. And then I remembered something. I was flying via airways. The only change in course I could make was up and down. But the weather looked good. Smooth sailing everywhere. I knew I could save a lot of time by swinging off there to the northeast and taking a straight run for the coast. So I did a 90 to the right and sailed merrily away. "20 minutes later, I was in trouble. I'd forgotten that up in the north, weather changes a lot faster than the scenery. I wasn't going to get any caribou pictures that day. I was flying between an under and an overcast and in the roughest air I'd ever experienced. It took all I had to keep the plane level. That turbulence was a rare weather condition up there in the north, but rare or not, there it was, and it tossed us all over the sky. Several minutes later, the boys reported that our heavy cargo had broken loose. It was pounding the airframe to pieces. I was having it now, for sure. Off course, no visibility. No place I could see for an emergency landing. We'd have to get out, quick. I told Elmer to send out an SOS. We were just about through. He turned on the emergency signal on the IFF. Then he sent out a distress call. When he was finished, he clamped the key down. I had been eyeing that alarm button for the last few seconds. Now time was up. I rang the alarm. Prepare to bail out. Half a minute later, I pressed the jump signal. Our emergency equipment was pushed out. Our big survival kit went out okay, but that was the last we ever saw of it. Our emergency radio, too, was tossed out. Vic said later he saw it shoot open before he jumped, but it landed on some spot of the tundra we never could find. About a minute after the supplies went out, Vic found himself getting acquainted with a lot of mud. Well, he waded around in that muck for a bit, then discovered that those small mounds of vegetation would support his weight. Well, he looked around and decided that the tundra was not as pretty a place as it appeared from the air. Vic had used his head when he jumped. He had an anti-exposure suit with him tied to his harness in addition to his emergency vest. He was giving himself a chance. He couldn't see any of the rest of us who were to jump after him. A mile away, however, Irv Massey landed in a drier spot. He was okay, too. except he had no survival gear with him. His own bailout kit that he had stowed in the plane, he couldn't locate in the few hectic seconds before he jumped. The Tundra didn't look very inviting to him either. Well, it wasn't. Then, happily, he spotted one of the crew across the water on a higher bluff. It was Scott, my navigator. He'd made a good drop. Irv's bailout kit was with him. While taking off his gear, Scott heard my plane overhead. It sounded like I was coming in somewhere for a landing. He decided I'd found a hole in those clouds and seen a spot where I could crash land without having to bail out. He didn't know it then, but that's just what happened. He heard me hit. He marked the direction of the sound. 6 miles away, my plane was resting on the bottom of a tundra lake in which I had ditched her. Elmer watched Jim, who was in bad shape, while I maneuvered the life raft released at the time of the ditching to the tail of the plane. Between the two of us, we got Jim aboard. He was unconscious from a blow suffered when we hit. We finally got underway, positioning ourselves on the raft so as not to disturb Jim or to crush the supplies I had put aboard before the plane sank. We were numb from the cold. The water must have been about 35 degrees. We pulled hard to get to the shore. A fair breeze was blowing across the lake, and though it helped us with our paddling, it chilled us to the bone. Near the lake's edge, it was hard to tell where the lake actually ended and land began. Where the water appeared to be shallow, we climbed out. I swung the raft around, and Elmer rigged up one of the oars to serve as a tow bar. Within in place, we pulled Jim and our things through the muck. It was tough going. Jim weighed 210 pounds at least. As we stumbled away from the lake, the ground became drier and firmer underfoot. About 100 feet in from shore, we finally were obliged to stop. Soon we had Jim on the raft's bottom. A softer, more insulated support turned that way. Elmer opened the life raft's emergency kit. Jim was in shock, and we treated him as best we could. Elmer took one of the parachutes I had salvaged and placed it under Jim to elevate the lower part of his body. That was one of the things he remembered should be done. Jim had received an ugly gash, but the bleeding had stopped, so I knew that the cut in itself was not too serious. It was then I noticed my empty camera case. Camera. Boy, had my picture ideas backfired. Elmer knew it was in my mind. I couldn't say anything then, but I could think as I worked over Jim. We were over 100 miles from help of any sort. Jim here was injured, and 3 of my crew missing out on the tundra somewhere. We didn't have much in the way of supplies either. Just that life raft accessory kit, an anti-exposure suit, 2 parachutes, and a crash axe. Not much for a start, I knew. Everything else we might have obtained from the plane, like gasoline and oil for fuel, the radio and the extra stores, were gone for good in 20 feet of water. We were going to have to live for a long time on that dismal, pest-ridden tundra. My only hope then was that maybe Elmer's radio signal had been picked up before we crashed. I learned later that we were lucky. A small emergency Air Force field had heard our call. It sent off an emergency message about us to an inland operations base. There in Air Rescue Headquarters, a search operation was quickly organized. With but little information to go on, our supposed course from my flight plan indicated by the red line, and the DF bearing the blue, search was to be started in the vicinity of the intersection of the 2 lines. Well, this rescue flight CO had a definite search procedure outlined in no time. A report from the weather officer revealed that a cold front was moving fast into the search area. In a few hours, it would prevent all observation of the ground for 3 or 4 days at least. The CO assigned search sections to his pilots and told them to fly until the front moved in. He was certain that if my aircraft was down on course, it could be located quickly. He was right, too. But we weren't on course when I ditched the plane. Unfortunately, my wrecked C-82 was a hell of a lot of miles from the first search areas that were to be explored. Scott at his camp had a lot of trouble. Wet grass and little common sense just won't build a fire. Then something worse than not being able to light a fire happened. Right on his ear. A mosquito. One of the thousands that had been bothering Scott from the moment he landed on the Tundra. That constant biting now was becoming unbearable. Scott was no camper, obviously, with or without the supplies of Irv's well-equipped bailout kit. He hadn't even bothered to examine all the things in it. Scott located a head net in the bailout kit in a hurry. Now, there's a special way to wear a net, but my navigator had never examined one before. He had an old type net. After a while, trial and error proved that he'd better wear his hat beneath the net. It would help hold the fine mesh away from his skin so that the mosquitoes couldn't bite through it from the outside. The insects were biting his hands, too, uncovered as they were. Those gloves supplied by the bailout kit Scott had to wear most of the time from then on. Well, what to do next? He remembered then that he was trying to build a fire and went back to work. Across the water from Scott, a fire actually was being lit. Irv Massey used his cigarette lighter and some dry scrap paper he found in his wallet to kindle a blaze. He was using his head. The mosquitoes were bothering him, too, but he got into the smoke of the fire, which lessened their attack for a while. Then he got the idea of using a couple of pieces of parachute shroud lines to good advantage. He tied them about his pants cuffs so that the insects could not get under his clothes. Also around his wrists. Brother, you leave any sort of an opening in your clothes and those pests will find it. But quick. Irv didn't have a head net, but he had an idea how to make one with some parachute material. He cut 2 holes in a section of the cloth, and he pulled the hood-like affair over his face. A couple of short lengths of shroud lines left attached to the corners of the improvised net he used for tying the cloth snugly at his neck. A pair of sunglasses he had with him was a final touch to a most adequate net. He may have looked like the Invisible Man, but the mask worked. He noticed there was a good possibility of rain. A shelter was his next problem. For a cover, he had his parachute. Soon, with sod blocks cut from the ground, as there was no wood in that section of the tundra to use for a tent support, Irv built a sort of sod wall headboard, I guess you'd call it that, and a footboard. His parachute he draped over those earth supports and anchored it with extra squares of sod blocks. The roof, as well as the floor of his tent, was formed of several thicknesses of the chute. It provided good insulation. He drew the material tightly over the headboard so that it wouldn't sag in the middle. Then, using the shroud line still attached to the chute, he staked the cover securely to the ground. My other flight engineer, Vic, got a fire going at his camp with a tab from the emergency vest's fire-starting kit and a piece of paper that the vest's hunting knife came wrapped in. He added some grass and brush pulled up from the area and got a good blaze going. Because of the high content of pitch in many tundra plants, we found that green or wet, most of them would burn once a fire was started. A hat, head net, and gloves from the emergency vest solved Vic's mosquito problem. For a bed, he decided to make a sleeping bag. But first, he built a mattress of willow brush cuttings gathered nearby to insulate and raise his bedside above the ground. The grass and mossy carpet of the tundra was just like a wet sponge. A parachute bedroll, diagrammed in the small booklet you've seen in your own chute, Emergency Uses of the Parachute, Vic folded with little trouble. Many layers of the material gave him plenty of insulation, as well as mosquito protection. Scott still was having his troubles. Now a hole burned in his net when he tried to blow life into his fire. The type of net he had was inflammable. It would be. Brother, that was a hole 10,000 mosquitoes could get through. He knew he'd have to patch it immediately, and he did, sewing a small piece of chute material in place with a needle and thread from the bailout kit. In short order, his net was just about as good as new. From then on, he decided to take extra special care of that net. It was just about the most valuable thing he had with him. And then Scott realized he was hungry. He hadn't eaten for a good 6 hours. He almost opened that emergency ration tin when he remembered the rest of the crew who might be down without any food at all. Well, he could eat a candy bar he had with him. That should take the edge off his appetite. But trying to eat and wear a mosquito net at the same time had its disadvantages. I made the same mistake with my net at least once a day myself. Then more trouble for the navigator. His fire. He'd forgotten about it. Just about out again. The sight of Irv's nicely burning fire across the water didn't improve Scott's disposition. Those little things sure can get you down. He realized that he needed a rest. He had the sleeping bag from the bailout kit. He should have put the waterproof cover around it. But that was Scott for you. He believed the ground where he laid the bag would be warm from the fire, which had smoldered there for a while. But most tundra ground can't be warmed, as just 18 inches below the surface is what is called permafrost, permanently frozen ground. At our camp, Elmer and I constructed a shelter. We used oars for uprights, parachute shrouds for lines, and pollen for the roof. Elmer had made us all mosquito nets out of gauze from the life raft's emergency first aid kit. We had Jim dressed in the anti-exposure suit for mosquito protection as well as warmth. He came to about then and opened his eyes. He asked for water. I had some heating over the fire on a grill made of our parachute pack's wire frame. Jim drank it down and went back to sleep. Yeah, I sure hoped he would snap out of it. Elmer checked through the life raft signal kit to have something ready in case we sighted a plane. In the kit were handheld smoke bombs and 2-star signal flares. From our other supplies in our life raft kit, we have some sea marking dye. We had a handy signal mirror, too, and though of no use to us then with 24 hours of sunlight, a self-energizing flashlight. Elmer found a whistle. Needing more shelter, we built an addition to Jim's tent. An extra life raft pollen made a waterproof floor. The guy ropes formed a support to hold up one of our parachutes draped over it. It wasn't too bad a job for a quick one. My old waterproof watch was still ticking away. I told Elmer to get some sleep. For bright as it was after midnight. I knew we should all try to get as much rest as we could. We had a lot of work ahead of us. I had plenty of things on my mind at the end of that day. I remembered the small booklet I had with me. It was damp, but usable. I decided it would be a good thing to start keeping a diary. It would make interesting reading, I thought, if we ever got out of that spot. There was no sign of that overcast breaking up. I wondered how long we were down for and what had happened to the rest of my crew. Then I noticed that camera case where Elmer had hung it, and a lot of grief it stood for. I couldn't call going off my course fate. I knew what I was doing when I did it. Boy, I gladly would have traded places with the devil that night. Nobody could be worse off than I was. First day, camp established. 3 men missing. No hope of rescue, yet. The next morning, Vic awoke with a terrific thirst. He tried to make up his mind about the water in the tundra pools. It certainly wasn't sparkling clear. It was a dark tea color and appeared to be full of mosquito larvae. Although he'd heard that most tundra water found away from human habitation was safe, he decided to take no chances. He had halazone tablets in his vest's first aid kit, and he used them. He put a couple of the pills in the bag. The directions said wait half an hour before drinking. About 10 minutes later, still waiting for the halazone to work, Vic spotted something on horizon. It looked like a campfire one of the other men had built. He made up his mind quickly he was going to travel. At his own camp, he stamped out his fire in a hurry. He didn't want anyone to see the smoke and attempt to reach him. He was okay, but the spot he camped in was pretty soggy. He threw his things together in a hurry and stuffed them into the parachute pack, rehooking the elastic cords to hold everything together. Then he went about rigging a sling to carry the pack. He used the double 8-foot length of the harness strap. The loop portion was drawn over the head. Then each end of the tie was turned a couple of times around the head loop. This pack was a simple matter for one man to put on by himself. It was called the reindeer pack. It was quick donning and easy to carry. Finally, with the pack on his shoulders, Vic was ready to start off. He left a note behind, scribbled on a page from the vest survival manual. It gave his name, the date, and his destination. Don't count on any more. You don't walk across the tundra, you stumble through it. Vic discovered after a couple of mistakes that the shortest way across that terrain was not a straight line. To prevent getting your feet wet, you've got to stick to high ground. Irv Massey wrapped up Camp 2 that morning after deciding to try to join Scott on the other side of the body of water that separated them. Vic approached in the background after a mile of hard traveling and spied his pal. Soon there was a happy meeting. Survivors are people who love to have company drop in. As Vic summed up their survival situation as he knew it, he got an idea how to make a better mosquito net for himself using some more of the parachute material and some of Vic's net. With his pocket knife, Irv carefully sliced Vic's net, cutting it in 2 equal pieces. He then took a small corner section of his parachute and spread it out. On it, he laid out a pattern of the exact size and shape of one of the net halves. This section of the material would be a substitute for the part of the net now cut away. Soon, with a needle and thread from the vest sewing kit, Irv had 2 cloth patterns of similar shape sewn to each section of the netting. Now both men had a net. 1 mosquito net was made to serve for 2. Vic was darn relieved to get his altered net, and he was much impressed with Irv's ingenuity. Irv was happy to trade his old net for the new one, which allowed more ventilation and provided better vision. Well, after breaking camp, Irv showed Vic how to dig a good marker to indicate which way they were traveling. A large dirt arrow visible to any plane that might be looking for them. At the lake's edge, separating them from Scott, Irv told Vic that he'd scouted the shore, which seemed endless. They'd have to cross over. That water was about 40 degrees, Vic estimated. They couldn't swim that. But Irv had an idea. Vic had forgotten about the anti-exposure suit. Well, next to having a boat, that was just about the best thing they could want for tundra traveling. Irv got into the suit, parachute pack and all. The safety line, over 200 yards of it, was made by tying together the shroud lines of just one of our chutes. Irv was now ready for the swim. As he moved off, Vic paid out the line, but was ready to pull him back if anything went wrong. Well, Irv had no trouble crossing. The watertight suit easily floated him and all the gear he carried. Scott had spotted the 2 men from his camp, and he came down and helped Irv ashore. Scott told him he'd seen no sign of the rest of the crew, but that he'd heard our plane crash. Irv's immediate problem was to get Vic. He gave Scott an extra supply of shroud line he'd brought with him, which he planned to use in helping Vic across. Then he climbed out of his suit. The 2 men knotted the sleeves and closed the neck of the rubber garment. Irv then rolled it toward the feet. Enough air was left trapped inside the suit to make it buoyant. It was tied tightly. Then, with 2 lines attached to it, the one extending to Vic across the water, and the other one on this side, which Irv fed out, the suit was tossed into the water for Vic to pull over to his side. Vic soon had the suit. In a few minutes, he was inside it. He, too, found the rubber garment roomy. It was large enough to enclose himself, the emergency vest he wore, and his parachute pack. With Irv and Scott pulling on the other side, Vic was across the body of water in no time. At Scott's camp, the boys looked the place over. Irv immediately spied his bailout kit. In it, he quickly located a most important item, a bottle of insect repellent. Obviously, Scott had overlooked it. That find really made him look like a sap. Promptly, the boys tried out the repellent, and it really worked. Irv tested it on his bare hands. We discovered later that a couple of daubs well smeared around like that would last quite a few hours. Scott was impatient to try it. He showed some sense when he put it on his face, but he kept it well away from his mouth and eyes. He used it on his hands okay, too, but he would have poured it all over himself if he hadn't been stopped. Irv showed Scott the trick of tying his sleeves and pants legs. Later, Scott told the men of hearing our plane crack up somewhere off in the distance. He had an idea that I hadn't jumped after all. Irv took charge of things and told the men to pack. They would look for the plane right away. Vic put a lot of wood on the fire, and then, to make it smoke, added green grass. That smoke column was to be a checkpoint for direction determination in case they got lost. They located a compass in the bailout kit and lined it up with Scott's marker to get a heading. Soon the boys were packed up and underway. They left a colored panel cut from one of their chutes to mark their direction. It made a most conspicuous arrow. That was another one of Irv's ideas. The men never forgot that hike. That tundra was just about the roughest, wettest, sloppiest terrain that any of them had ever traveled over. Having the anti-exposure suit with them, they were able to ford a couple of wide streams they would never have been able to cross otherwise. Mosquitoes were everywhere and plagued them constantly. A couple of hours later, the effort they had taken to keep going in one direction paid off. There was our camp by the side of the lake. Elmer saw them. I was busy splinting Jim's leg, which we discovered broken after he came to. When Elmer gave me the news, I was one relieved pilot at that moment. My crew's safe arrival was the first good thing that had happened since the crack-up. I called a general meeting as soon as the boys rested up and outlined our entire situation.